Words of Sri Aurobindo from the book Letters on Yoga, Part 1, from the collective works of Sri Aurobindo, Volume 28, page 173, topic The Mind, subtopic Western Ideas of Mind and Spirit. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says Saint Augustine was a man of God and a great saint, but great saints are not always or often great psychologists or great thinkers. The psychology here is that of the most superficial schools, if not that of the man in the street. There are as many as errors in it as there are psychological statements, and more, for several are not expressed but involved in what he writes. Sri Aurobindo says, I am aware that these errors are practically universal. For psychological inquiry in Europe, and without inquiry there can be no sound knowledge, is only a beginning and has not yet gone very far, and what has reigned in men's minds up to now is a superficial statement of the superficial appearances of our consciousness as they look to us at very first view, and nothing more. But knowledge only begins when we get away from the surface phenomenon and look behind them for their true operations and causes. Sri Aurobindo says, to the superficial view of the outer mind and senses, the sun is a little fiery ball circling in mid-air around the earth, and the stars twinkling little things stuck in the sky for our benefit at night. Sri Aurobindo says, scientific inquiry comes and knocks this infantile first view to pieces. The sun is a huge affair, millions of miles away from our air, and on which the small earth circles, and the stars are huge members of huge systems indescribably distant, which have nothing apparently to do with the tiny earth and her creatures. Sri Aurobindo says, all science is like that, a contradiction of the sense view or superficial appearances of things, and an assertion of truths which are unguessed by the common sense and the uninstructed reason. The same process has to be followed in psychology if we are really to know what our consciousness is and how it is built and made, and what is the secret of the functionings or the way out of its disorders. Sri Aurobindo says there are several capital and common errors here. First point, that mind and spirit are the same thing. Second, that all consciousness can be spoken of as mind. Third, that all consciousness therefore is of a spiritual substance. Fourth, that the body is merely matter, not conscious, therefore something quite different from the spiritual part of the nature. Sri Aurobindo says, first, the spirit and the mind are two different things and should not be confused together. The mind is an instrumental entity or instrumental consciousness whose function is to think and perceive. The spirit is an essential entity or consciousness which does not need to think or perceive either in the mental or the sensory way, because whatever knowledge it has is direct or essential knowledge, Swayam Prakasha. Sri Aurobindo says, next, it follows all consciousness is not necessarily of a spiritual make, and it need not be true, and is not true that the thing commanding and the thing commanded are the same, are not at all different, are of the same substance, and therefore are bound or at least ought to agree together. Sri Aurobindo says, third, it is not even true that it is the mind which is commanding the mind and finds itself disobeyed by itself. First, there are many parts of the mind, each a force in itself, with its formations, functionings, interests, and they may not agree. One part of the mind may be spiritually influenced and like to think of the divine and obey the spiritual impulse. Another part may be rational or scientific or literary and prefer to follow the formations, beliefs or doubts, mental preferences and interests which are in conformity with its education and its nature. Sri Aurobindo says, but quite apart from that, what was commanding in St. Augustine may very well have been the thinking mind or reason, while what was commanded was the vital, and mind and vital, whatever anybody may say, are not the same. The thinking mind or buddhi lives, however imperfectly, in man by intelligence and reason and tries to act or makes the rest act under that law as far as and in the way that it has convinced the law of intelligence and reason. The vital, on the other hand, is a thing of desires, impulses, force, pushes, emotions, sensations, seekings after life fulfillment, possessions, and enjoyment. These are its function and its nature. It is that part of us which seek after life and its moments for their own sake, and it does not want to leave hold of them, even if they bring it suffering as well as more than pleasure. It is even capable of luxuriating in tears and suffering as a part of the drama of life. What then is there in common between the thinking intelligence and the vital? And why should the latter obey the mind and not follow its own nature? Sri Aurobindo says that disobedience is perfectly normal instead of being, as Augustine suggests, unintelligible. Of course, man can establish a mental control over his vital, and in so far as he does it, he is a man, because the thinking mind is a nobler and more enlightened entity and consciousness than the vital, and ought therefore to rule, and if the mental will is strong, can rule. But this rule is precarious, incomplete, and established and held only by much self-discipline. For if the mind is more enlightened, the vital is nearer to earth, more intense, vehement, more directly able to touch the body. There is too a vital mind which lives by imagination, thoughts of desire, will to act and enjoy from its own impulse, and this is able to seize on the reason itself and make it its auxiliary and its justifying counsel and supplier of pleas and excuses. There is also the sheer force of desire in man, which is the vital's principal support and strong enough to sweep off the reason, as the Gita says, like a boat in stormy waters. Navam ivam basi. Finally, the body obeys the mind automatically in those things in which it is formed or trained to obey it. But the relation of the body to the mind is not in all things that of an automatic perfect instrument. The body also has a consciousness of its own, and though it is a submental instrument or servant consciousness, it can disobey or fail to obey as well. In many things, in matters of health and illness for instance, in all automatic functionings, the body acts on its own and is not a servant of the mind. If it is fatigued, it can offer a passive resistance to the mind's will. It can cloud the mind with tamas, inertia, dullness, fumes of the subconscious so that the mind cannot act. The arm lifts itself, no doubt, when it gets the suggestion. But at first, the legs do not obey when they are asked to walk. They have to learn how to leave the crawling attitude and movement and take up the erect and ambulatory habit. Sri Aurobindo says when you first ask the hand to draw a straight line or to play music, it can't do it and won't do it. It has to be schooled, trained, taught, and afterwards it does automatically what is required of it. All this proves that there is a body consciousness different from the mind consciousness, which can do things at the mind's order, but has to be awakened, trained, made a good and conscious instrument. It can even be so trained that a mental will or suggestion can cure the illnesses of the body. But all these things, these relations of mind and body, stand on the same footing in essence as a circulation of mind to vital, and it is not so easy as primary a matter as Augustine would have it. Sri Aurobindo says this puts the problem on another footing with the causes more clear, and if we are prepared to go far enough, it suggests the way out, the way of yoga. Sri Aurobindo says, please note, all this is quite apart from the contributing and the very important factor of plural personality, of which psychological inquiry is just a beginning, rather obscurely to take account. That is a more complex affair. Sri Aurobindo says the non-materialistic European idea of the true soul or person makes a distinction between soul and body. The body is perishable. The mental vital consciousness is the immortal soul and remains always the same. Horrible idea, says Sri Aurobindo. In heaven as on earth, or if there is rebirth, it is also the same damned personality that comes back and makes a similar fool of itself. Next subtopic, the psychic mind. Sri Aurobindo says when the mind is turned towards the divine and the truth and feels and responds to that only, or mainly it can be called a psychic mind, it is something formed by the influence of the psychic being on the mental plane. Psychic mind and mental psychic are the same thing practically. When there is a moment of the mind in which the psychic influence predominates, it is called the psychic in the mind or the psychic mind. We will continue this tomorrow. These are the words of our Lord Sri Aurobindo.